Well, thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thank you for being here wherever here means for you. So for me, it's in Adelaide on Kaurna land. And in fact, I'm in my office on campus, despite the fact that we're all meant to be working from home. But I really wish I was with you in person because MAWA is a great conference and the shared moments of being in the same space together really add to our learning. It certainly has been a year of challenges and presenting remotely to you where I can't see you and on a 10-second delay is certainly not the challenge that I envisaged at the start of the year, but I'm sure we're going to get through this together. So we can still share moments with each other virtually. The first thing is you can hit me up on Twitter at @NomadPenguin. I spend way too much of my life on social media. You can also use the conference hashtag MAWACon2020 to tweet about this session. And secondly, I'd like us hopefully to be able to interact during the session, despite the fact that I can't see you. So you're going to need a device. Your phone is fine. And what I'd like you to do, let's see if this works. I'd like you to go to www.menti.com and enter the code that you can see on the screen. And there'll be a prompt in there for you to respond to. And just so that you know, your responses are anonymized. So no one knows what you're putting in. So I'm hoping people are starting to access and to log in. I should say, speaking of upping the difficulty level, this is the first time I've used this platform, so we'll see what happens. All right, so, oh, this is beautiful, folks. I'm hoping that you can see the word cloud that's coming up here. Pythagoras, Ramanujan, Gauss. Beautiful. So this is going to work very well for us. So on the many screens that I have on the desk in front of me, I'm also going to advance to slides where you can ask me questions or comments along the way. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to see them. And at least if I don't respond in the moment, I'll respond at the end in the question time. Okay. So, oh, that didn't work. Let me try this again. Okay, here we go. So today I want to talk about humanizing mathematics, and it's a topic that I approach with humility because there are practitioners and scholars who speak and write with far greater knowledge than me. I want to draw on both their work, but also my own experiences in classrooms, in academia, and more broadly, to examine what I mean by inclusive humanizing mathematics environments. And I hope that the next hour sparks some new thoughts for you. And if they do, feel very free to share them with us either on Menti or on social media. And I'm also going to issue an apology in advance because if you're an avid reader like me, you might leave this session with several books on your to-buy list. So what does it mean to humanize mathematics? Being a mathematician, I thought I'd start with a definition. And in some ways, like in mathematics, it's easier to start defining a concept by what it is not rather than what it is. So I turned to the dictionary to examine what is meant by dehumanizing mathematics. And this is what I found. To dehumanize is to deprive of human qualities or attributes, to divest of individuality. And the act of dehumanizing leads to dehumanization. The denial of full humanness in others and the cruelty and suffering that accompanies it. Now, these are strong and powerful words, and they're perhaps confronting because to think about what it means to dehumanize mathematics is to reflect on our experiences at school as learners and in our careers as educators. But I think if we are to seriously consider why so many people in our community and indeed in our classrooms feel disconnected from it and discouraged by mathematics, then we need to listen to their experiences with open minds and with open hearts, and then grapple with what may be uncomfortable truths. So I'd like you to think on these two questions. Have you experienced or witnessed dehumanization in mathematics? And what in mathematics feels dehumanizing to you? So these are big questions, so you might like to think about them by yourself or with someone near you, or you might like to add your thoughts to the Menti as well. And so the person asking for the code, it's there on the screen. So what in mathematics feels dehumanizing to you? I'll give you just a couple more moments. These are some excellent examples, folks. Wow, this is so rich. The looks when you say you are a maths teacher, straight to your identity. I agree. Okay, I'll leave that open so that you can share some more as well. Oh, every time I do that, it jumps me out, but I think you can see my slides now. Okay, so one of the things I do at uni is I teach a mathematical thinking course for pre-service teachers. And at the start of each semester, I ask my students to write their maths autobiography. That is their personal story with mathematics. And the purpose is to have them reflect on their experiences with mathematics, because it may help inform how they will approach the next 15 weeks in my class, but also their years ahead as teachers. And of course, the autobiography also helps me to know more about them and their attitudes towards mathematics. Now, reading their autobiographies is one of my favourite moments of the year, because every semester they write of inspiring maths teachers, of the excitement and joy that they've experienced when solving problems, and of understanding concepts. They also write about experiences that I would regard as dehumanizing, and I want to share some of them with you now. So they write about when maths feels like a competition or a high stakes environment, with words like a race, strict, competitive, stressful, or when they feel disconnected from what they're learning. They can't relate it to their own lives and experiences. Like, this student couldn't even envisage the situations that they were learning about. They describe situations where they felt belittled or embarrassed or humiliated or singled out, or when they were only taught one way of doing things, and so their approach, which might have been different, wasn't acknowledged or valued or legitimized as being an appropriate way of doing it. They talk about when the environment wasn't conducive to growth or to collaboration or to seeking understanding, which is what I think is needed for a productive mathematical learning environment. Or when being good at maths challenged their identities, getting answers purposefully wrong because it's not cool to get good grades in maths. And then we can all laugh about it afterwards. And when they were denied full participation in mathematics because of who they are or how good they are at mathematics, whether that relates to their gender, their cultural or racial background, or something else. Or alternatively, when they were pushed into participation because of who they are or how good they are at mathematics. So because this student was good, they were expected to participate in and enjoy all of the mathematical activities. And it was that led them to become disenfranchised with maths. Now, I expect that all of us have had experiences similar to these, either when we were students ourselves or during our time as educators. And you might be sitting there feeling some kind of guilt associated with it. And please let me assure you that that is not my intention, because we're all human and we do things that at the time might seem reasonable, but later we regret. And I know that at times, probably many times, I have put my students on the spot and embarrassed them. I've insisted we do something a particular way without explanation, and I have unconsciously expected different things from different students depending on their identities. And I know that when these things happen, they slowly chip away at my classroom as an environment that's inclusive and humanizing. So to put it simply, to humanize mathematics, we need to make it more humane. We need to connect and adapt it to people and to make space for every person within mathematics. So I'd like to give us some more structure for considering this further. The Dutch educationalist Hert Biester suggests that education performs three different but related functions. And the one that is perhaps the most well understood as one of the main functions of organised education is qualification, that is the attainment of knowledge and skills. It's clearly reflected in the rationale for the Australian curriculum mathematics, which states that its purpose is to provide students with essential mathematics skills and knowledges, and to develop the numeracy capabilities that all students need in their personal, their work, and their civic lives. So in relation to humanizing mathematics, our questions might be, what and whose mathematics do we currently value in the curriculum? What mathematics should we value? And what would an ideal curriculum look like? So I want to sidestep from this framework for a moment to a mathematical puzzle. So in a moment, I'm going to show you a diagram, and I want you to answer two questions. What do you notice, and what do you wonder? So I'm hoping you're either talking to each other or you're having an opportunity to put it in the chat window on Menti. I might flick out and see what you're writing. I can't see that on my third screen. I'll give you a bit longer. I hope you're noticing all sorts of things, that it's not in English, that it forms this beautiful diamond shape, that there's some symmetry and some repetition. And many of you are starting to wonder if indeed it is what we call Pascal's triangle, and it is, but this is Yang Hui's triangle. It was used more than 400 years before what we call Pascal's triangle. And in fact, that structure was known by Indian and Persian mathematicians before its first appearance in Chinese manuscripts. So I am constantly learning that there are many things in mathematics that are named after predominantly white men that were actually used hundreds of years earlier by other people around the world, or were discovered independently and with preference to who we name it after. And it's finds like these that continually make me ask, what and whose mathematics do we value? And also, what mathematics have we been misattributing? So we might not control the curriculum in our classrooms, but we can choose to humanize mathematics by striving to provide a fuller picture of what it is that we teach. Okay, so to the second domain, education also has a socialization function. It puts individuals into existing ways of being and doing within established mathematical environments and communities. And in those environments, we transmit particular mathematical norms and values. So in relation to humanizing mathematics, we might ask ourselves, where is mathematics learned and used? Do students see themselves as using mathematical skills and reasoning in their everyday lives, or does it only exist for them inside the classroom? Who is excluded from participating in mathematics and who is included? What does the mathematical community look like? Does it reflect the general population? And how is mathematics done? What are the mathematical behaviours that we should encourage? Now, as I said, I have focused in the last few years primarily on this domain by examining how we incorporate authentic mathematical practices into our classrooms, and we'll come back to that a little later on. Biesta points out that even if socialization is not an explicit aim, education will have a socializing effect because students will learn implicitly what kinds of behaviours we value in mathematics by what we model and what we permit in the classroom, even if we don't mention those things explicitly. And finally, and most naturally, education always impacts upon the individual. What mathematics is learned and how mathematics is experienced shapes someone's identity. And that's what leads to curiosity and confidence, or to anxiety and disenchantment. For me, when I think about this domain, it also encapsulates the question, who are we teaching? How do we show them respect as individuals? For example, what are their gender pronouns? What name do they prefer to be called? How do you pronounce it? And how do we build relationships with our students? And these three domains should help us ask ourselves why we teach mathematics and for what purpose. And as you would expect, they interact in fundamental ways, whether we choose to focus on them or not, because what we teach and how we teach it impacts upon how students see themselves, both as individuals and in relation to the classroom. So as educators, as Biesta says, we need to take responsibility for what we seek to achieve in each domain, even if we don't explicitly focus on it. But now I want to focus on the socialization aspect. And I want to start with what the mathematical community looks like. So again, another graph and three questions this time. What do you notice? What do you wonder? And what's going on in this graph? So rather than start by explaining it to you, I'd rather give you a moment to make sense of the ideas for yourself. So this idea of writing a catchy headline comes from the New York Times. And they've got a series of weekly graphs that could be used to stimulate discussion in the classroom. They're US focused, of course, but you might get some good ideas of graphs that you can go and look for yourself. So there are some good questions coming up there in what you wonder. So someone has noticed that there are these different levels. So I will clarify that we're looking here at the maths profession at universities and research institutions in Australia. So this is, there are about 30 to 40 institutions, and level A is kind of the entry level. It's research associate, and then you go up through lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, and full professor at level A. Let's see if there are any other questions. Wonder how this compares. These are good questions. Why is it symmetrical? Let's talk about that in a moment. How does this correlate with age? Is there a gap? Is the gap a lag? We'll come to that question in a moment. Is this a result of women having breaks in their careers to have children? Yep, structural impediments definitely play a part in this. We'll come to gender issues around the dehumanizing nature of mathematics in a moment. We'll look at level E in particular. Blown away. Yeah, it's kind of astonishing, isn't it? Okay, so you might want to see the image again. I'll give you maybe another 30 seconds and then we'll pull it apart together. I'm hoping you can actually, is this different to other academic subjects at university? So that's a good question. I think I took the slide out, but Science and Equity Australia, I think that's the name, did all of the STEM subjects, including medicine. And the graph is not as pronounced, but it is similar in that it's kind of starts close together at undergraduate level, or sometimes even with a higher proportion of women than men, and then it kind of has that scissoring effect over time. And so, in fact, that's the point. This is called a scissor graph. And what you're seeing on the horizontal axis, as I started describing, is a measure of mathematical standing, and it becomes more advanced as we move from left, which is undergraduate enrolments and kind of postgraduate qualifications, all the way up to full professor. And the vertical axis is showing us the percentage of men and women. So this is only a binary gender representation at each of these levels, as was reported in 2018. Now, I said it's a scissor graph because as what typically happens is you have your pair of scissors, and often in these subjects, women's enrolments at undergraduate level can start higher and then gradually diminish over time. And men start slower and then increases. But as someone on Twitter pointed out to me, this is an unhinged scissor graph. It doesn't even start at a hinge point. So I guess that if you haven't seen this graph before, you might have kind of intuited that this would be the case, but for some of you, it's pretty striking. And it's a consequence of what's often called the leaky pipeline, as many of you noted, that women are progressively lost from the profession. And as some of you did ask, you might wonder if this is a lag effect and it will settle down over time. And so for that, we need some time series data. So this is 6 years of undergraduate enrolment in mathematics. And if we're interested in what's happening to women, we need to look at the width of the yellow and the brown section and how that changes over time, because that represents international and domestic female undergraduate students. So in 2012, that percentage was 34%, and in 2018, it was 38%. And in fact, all of that is owed to the increase in female international students. So it doesn't tell us much about what's happening domestically. Well, in fact, sorry, it's telling us that nothing much has changed domestically. And of course, you might be saying, well, that's only 6 years of data. Well, I went and looked at 18 years of honours data, and that shows a similar trend. In the 1980s, the average proportion of women completing an honours degree was 26%. It rose slightly to 31% in the 90s, but actually in the last decade, it's got worse. It's fallen below 25%. So we know that women are underrepresented in mathematics, and that's no surprise to me, given I've spent the last 20 years in academia. But the graph that drove this home for me is the following one. So this is exactly the same data that you saw in the unhinged scissor graph, but now it's absolute number of men and women at each of these university academic levels. So remember, the most junior is at the top, level A, and the most senior is toward the bottom at level E. And when this graph came out last year, I was a senior lecturer, a level C. And I realized while looking at this graph that I could name almost every single woman at level E. There were 25.6 full-time equivalents of these women. So I could look around Australia at the 30 to 40 universities and research institutions, and in about 20 minutes, I could name almost all of these women. And even if I could name twice as many men, there were still 200 that I didn't know. And that to me really showed kind of what a rare breed we were, particularly at senior levels. So you might be asking, well, you're focused on binary gender. What about other underrepresented and underincluded groups and knowledges? That's a question I've also asked along with other people. And as far as I know, this range of demographic information is not broadly collected or published for the mathematics profession, which is a real shame, because I think over the last decade, we've made some really good inroads into starting to make the profession more inclusive. And yet we don't have that data to track what's actually happening. But it's reported better, to my understanding, at school level. And in fact, the Australian Mathematical Sciences Institute publishes a discipline profile of what's happening at schools. And you might want to check that out and see what's reported there. So why does representation matter? Well, many people say that you can't be what you can't see, but there are many counterexamples to that. I myself am one, and perhaps you are too. I grew up in a small country town, knowing almost no one who had gone to university, and certainly no one who had studied for a degree in mathematics. And the only mathematicians I vaguely knew of were the ones whose names were connected to formulae in our textbooks. And maybe that's where the names came from in the word cloud earlier. But I do think that it's easier to be what you can see. And that's one reason why representation matters. And a good project that does this is the Math Girls project. So this is the brainchild of Chrissy Newell and her young daughter Cora in California. A couple of years ago, they were reading Talithia Williams' book, Power in Numbers, The Rebel Women of Mathematics. And as they read, Cora exclaimed, well, why didn't I know this before? Everyone should know their names. And the Math Gals t-shirt project was born. Now, I am the model on the right, and they are names of Australian women in mathematics. So Chrissy and I created this earlier this year to raise money for the Australian bushfire appeal. It's completely Chrissy's idea. I just supplied the names. And after quite a bit of struggle thinking how I could just whittle down the list to 8, I picked these 8 who are firsts for some reason. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to chat with the person next to you. See how many of these you know and can attach last names to. I don't have a Menti slide for this one, so you'll just have to do that one in person. Okay, so that's your 30 seconds. How did you go? These are 8 remarkable women, but in many ways, I consider Hannah Neumann to be especially so. So Hannah fled Nazi Germany to the UK with her Jewish fiance, who also became a prominent Australian mathematician. And she enrolled at Oxford to do her PhD while Bernard was away in the army. Hannah completed her thesis by candlelight in a rented caravan as a single parent with 2 young children underfoot, which not having children, I just find remarkable. The whole family came to Australia in the early 60s to the Australian National University, where they eventually named a building after her, and Hannah became the first woman professor of mathematics in Australia. She also had a keen interest in maths education and was a foundation vice president of the Australian Association of Mathematics Teachers. And both the AAMT and the Australian Mathematical Society have named lecture series in her honour. Now, as West Australians, I expect that many of you would know Cheryl Prager. She became the 2nd woman professor of mathematics in Australia at the age of 35. And Cheryl has a string of awards and honours to her name, many for which she was a trailblazer, not just for women, but for mathematicians. So, for example, she was the first mathematician to be awarded the Prime Minister's Prize for Science. And one thing that's notable about Cheryl, as indeed with many of these women, is their service and dedication to encouraging and enabling a wider range of people to go on with mathematics. And they're all remarkable role models for everyone, not just for girls and women. And I'm going to leave it to you to find out more about them. Representation needs to go beyond increasing the visibility of women, as I said, and as you're probably sitting there and thinking. So I want to tell you briefly now about a project by Annie Perkins. Annie's a maths teacher in Minnesota, and she created this project when one of her students, who rarely participates in class, asked why they only ever talk about white dudes. And so Annie knew that this particular student identified strongly with his Mexican heritage. And so she asked him whether it would matter if she showed him a Mexican mathematician. And when Annie tells this story, she says, he paused, he got a weird look on his face, and he responded with one of the most depressing questions she'd ever heard, which is, do you think there are any? And she assured him that there must be Mexican mathematicians, but when he pressed, she couldn't name any. And so his suspicions were essentially confirmed. So that night she went home, she researched a Mexican mathematician, Diego Rodriguez. She prepped a 5-minute talk about him and what he'd contributed for class the next day. And her student was so excited, and for the rest of the year, frequently talked about Rodriguez as a point of pride. So there are resources on Annie's website, but the short version is posted there. Essentially, take 10 to 15 minutes a week, prepare one slide about a mathematician, their title, their biographical information, about their education, their mathematics speciality, and their accomplishments. Or you could even set it as projects for your own students. And Annie's got a huge list of mathematicians that you could draw from and what it is about them and which communities they belong to. So clearly representation matters so that more people can see themselves as belonging in mathematics. But it goes beyond that, because the counterpart to this statement is that mathematics needs a diversity of people in order to grow in new ways. It needs diverse backgrounds, new expertise, fresh ideas to draw from. As Francis Su says in his beautiful, profound book, which I would encourage everybody to read, the field of mathematics is itself poorer because of the voices that are not present. So again, I'd like to tell you another story, and it's a story that illustrates this point. And this time we're going to do a little bit of mathematics. We're going to take a journey through the history of convex pentagonal tilings. So here we have a pentagon. It's convex because if we pick any 2 points within the pentagon and draw a straight line between them, that line always stays inside the shape. And the question that captured the minds of mathematicians was, which pentagons tile the plane. In other words, which pentagons can be used to cover a plane with no overlaps and no gaps. So just like laying tiles on your bathroom or your kitchen floor. So I'm going to colour the edges of this particular pentagon just so we can keep track of what's going on. And I'm going to pick this pentagon up, rotate it, and I'm going to duplicate it, sorry, and then rotate it and put the blue edges together. So I'm hoping that's what's just happened. And so now I've created this new unit. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to duplicate it and I'm going to attach it to its copy. And what you'll notice is that the top of this shape is navy blue and green, and the bottom is green and navy blue. So they're exactly the same length. So I should be able to do it and have them fit snugly, which, if you trust my rather amateur animation skills, those two things fit precisely together. And now you can see what I'm going to do next, perhaps. The left-hand side of this new shape is purple, pink. And so it should fit snugly into the right-hand side of this shape if I copy it and paste it in. And so indeed, that's what happens. And if we continue on in this way, we're going to tile the whole plane. So this is a pentagonal tiling. So this tiling is of type 1 because this classification means that any pentagonal tiling that meets these conditions, that is that the angles at B and C sum to 180 degrees and that the angles at A, D and E sum to 360 degrees, any pentagonal shape that tiles, that meets this condition, is called a tiling of type 1. And so there are, of course, other pentagons that have these properties that tile that also belong in this group. So that was the question. Now, in 1918, the German mathematician Karl Reinhardt identified the first 5 types of pentagonal tiles. And these each have, yes, tiling is tessellation. These each have their own little conditions. Then it was another 50 years until the next 3 were found by a mathematician called Richard Kirschner. And these are some examples of those 3 tilings. Another 8 years later, in 1975, Richard James, a Californian computer scientist, was reading about Kirschner's work in Martin Gardner's July column of the Scientific American, which was a very popular column that ran monthly for many, many years. And James decided not to look at Kirschner's list, but to see if he could find some pentagonal tilings for himself. And so he found the one that's indexed here as type 10. If you're wondering why it's not type 9, I'll be honest, I don't know either. So if someone finds out, let us know. Okay, and the next 4, these 4 were found by Marjorie Rice, and she's the person I want to focus on in this story. So Marjorie was born in Florida in 1923. She went to a 1-room country school where she skipped a couple of grades and studied with the older kids. But despite her love of learning, her family's poverty and the cultural norms prevented her from ever contemplating to go on to college or university. So she became a homemaker and a mother of 5 children. And she gave one of her sons a subscription to the Scientific American, partly so that she could read it while the kids were at school. So in his December 1975 column, Martin Gardner published Richard James's result, the type 10 tiling, and importantly noted that Richard James was an amateur mathematician. And the minute that Marjorie saw that, she was off and running. She later said, well, it made me wonder if he could find one, maybe I could. Marjorie had no formal training in mathematics. She only did 1 year of maths at high school. And so, of course, her work was unconventional. She developed her own notation. But in just 2 months, she was sure that she had found new types of tiling pentagons. And so she wasn't sure what to do, so she sent them off to Martin Gardner. And he, in turn, sent them to an expert in tiling patterns, Doris Schatzsnyder. And she was at first skeptical due to this unconventional work, but worked through them and later verified them to be new types of pentagonal tilings. And Marjorie's work in this area ended up being prolific. Over time, she found not just these 4 types, but 60 distinct tessellations using pentagons. So pentagons that fit into these various definitions but are distinct from each other. Many years later, Doris said that mathematicians tend to think that someone like Marjorie is an anomaly. And I quote, "A lot of them get so wrapped up they don't even entertain the idea that someone without credentials could make a real contribution." And she said that although amateurs may not speak the professional lingo, their passionate will to know, their intense concentration, and their fresh perspectives can make up for a lack of specialised training. Now, I love this story for so many reasons. Marjorie's tenacity and willingness to have a go, the importance of being able to identify with others, in this case, another amateur, the value of communicating mathematical ideas to a largely non-technical audience like Martin Gardner did over his whole career. And also how Marjorie's achievements kind of stuck it to the establishment. You know, this notion that it's only people with formal training and qualifications that have ideas that's worth listening to, I think that's nonsense. So I'm just going to finish off the tiling story very quickly. So the 14th one was found by Rolf Stein in 1985. And then 30 years later, a group of 3 American mathematicians who were working together used a computer to exhaustively search through a large but finite set of possibilities. And they found a 15th one. And then the question was, were there any more? A mathematician called Michael Rao showed in 2017 that there are no more new types that tile the plane. And so these 15 types are it. And that asterisk is because I think the proof is still being verified. I'm not sure if it's been judged correct. So Marjorie Rice participated in mathematics having overcome structural barriers. But other people are turned off mathematics because they have had dehumanizing experiences. So we need to cast our mind to how to make mathematics more inclusive. So here, I'm going to introduce another book that is worth a read, and that's the book by Eugenia Chang. So she's written a fascinating book that tackles this topic. On the face of it, the book appears to be primarily about gender, and that is a thread that goes through, but it's actually a lot more than that. Because Eugenia points out that so far our approach has essentially been to ask underrepresented groups to lean in, to adapt themselves to the environment around them, to go to workshops on how to be a woman in mathematics or a woman in leadership or something like that. I have been to many of those workshops and I have organised many of those workshops. They're good things, but we tend to do that rather than address the cultural and structural impediments that prevent full participation by these people. So to address the cultural aspect, Eugenia argues that we should think less about gender and more about desirable behaviours. This is coming back to the socialisation aspect. So for example, a lot of people are put off, as we saw earlier, and as you told us, by competitiveness, answer getting, speed and accuracy, rule following, hierarchical knowledge building, and that stereotype of mathematicians as geniuses who work in isolation. So Eugenia has given us 2 new words to describe behaviours and attributes and situations. The first is ingressive, where the focus is on the habits that I just described, emphasising individualism, more competitive than collaborative, kind of focusing, if you like, on oneself. But in contrast to ingressive is congressive, which is a focus on building understanding, on seeing relationships between things, and of collaboration and cooperation. If we were to relate this back to gender, you might notice that boys are stereotypically described as more competitive and single-minded than girls, which are the ingressive qualities, and girls are stereotypically described as more collaborative and community-minded than boys, which is the congressive qualities. Now, of course, there are boys who are community-minded and girls who are competitive, and I said they were stereotypes. But if you follow that logic through, if boys are expected to be more aggressive, and if traditional maths environments are largely aggressive, then that would contribute to more men than women continuing on with mathematics. And so then we see the leaky pipeline or the unhinged scissor graph just kind of unfolding before our eyes. So my own experiences at school and university were largely aggressive. Yours probably were as well. And yet doing mathematical research has been largely congressive. It was only when at the end of third year, I went to a mathematics and industry study group that my perspective changed. So some of you will have heard me describe this before. It's a 5-day gathering that draws around 100 mathematicians together to solve real world problems that come from industry. And the mathematicians haven't seen the problems before the event. So the last 2 times I've tried to work on establishing whether road safety cameras reduce crashes, and I've looked at optimizing the operations in meat abattoirs. So 2 very different problems, not things I usually think about. And for me, this was the first time I saw how mathematicians collaboratively and creatively approach problem solving without a regard to mathematical hierarchy, in discussion, really organically. And this is precisely what Eugenia Chang describes as congressive research. And lest you think this experience is just mine, it's also been the way for these 2 Fields medalists, Terry Tao and Miriam Mirzakhani. So both were firsts. Terry was the first Australian to win in 2006, and Miriam was the first Iranian and the first woman to be awarded the Fields Medal in 2014. Both of them were childhood prodigies and highly successful at the International Mathematics Olympiad, yet their mathematical careers were more congressive than ingressive. So Miriam famously called herself a slow thinker, and she'd spread out huge pieces of paper on the floor and draw diagrams and doodles to make connections between ideas. Terry's led several open online collaborations, a bit like the MISG, but for tough, pure mathematics problems, where mathematicians pool their ideas, electing not to try and take credit for themselves and save up the accomplishment, but to make rapid progress on a problem together. And a really interesting story in this regard is the twin primes conjecture and what they did with that. So most of us start our lives, our mathematical journeys, congressively with play and experimentation to build understanding. And then at some point, our experience becomes largely ingressive. And for many people, this is where it stops. Quite sadly, for those of us who press on, it becomes congressive again. So I think at times about those people who kind of in the middle of that diagram had just what was needed to make contributions to mathematics, but became disenfranchised. And the field of mathematics and our community is poorer because those people are not present. Okay, so to the big question, I've spent perhaps 40 or 50 minutes getting to this point. How do we make mathematics more congressive? How do we make it more inclusive? And actually, I would like to draw on the wisdom in the room. Each one of you does something to build relationships and to encourage congressive mathematical behaviors in your classroom. So either turn to the person next to you or go into Menti again and share one thing you do to humanize mathematics that all of us can learn from. So this time I'm actually going to give you probably 4 to 5 minutes, come up with some ideas. I'll put up the results so that you can get ideas from others, and then we'll come back together and draw this to a close. Noise. I love my noisy classroom. My colleagues think I'm kind of weird, but yeah, as long as they're on track, and sometimes even if they're not, I love a noisy classroom. Develop a classroom where failure is okay, absolutely, and it's natural and it's needed in mathematics, because if you know how to do it the first time, then you're ready for something more challenging. Group work investigation, yep, work in collaboration and others. Sometimes that's exactly what's needed to make progress. Sometimes we need to work by ourselves, and that's totally fine too. Give students the whiteboard marker. I try to run my whole semester's worth of tutorials where I don't pick up a whiteboard marker. Every student in the room has one, and they're busy working by themselves. Communicate in many ways and with multiple representations, absolutely. Real world applications like financial mathematics. Discuss female mathematicians and scientists, and maybe people could start to draw on the Mathematicians Project and the Math Scales t-shirts for some more ideas. Go with tangents. Sometimes those off-track conversations are some of the most fruitful, especially if someone goes, I wonder what would happen if, and that's how mathematics is made. That history of ingression can be really challenging to overcome, but stick at it. You're not going to change your classroom into a congressive one overnight. And it's not even a two-dimensional, sorry, it's not even kind of a spectrum on a line where ingressive's at one end and congressive's the other. At times, our classrooms might need to be more ingressive than congressive, and vice versa. My favorite, no, that's one of my favorites as well. If you come to my workshop this afternoon on mathematical discussions, we'll talk about my favorite mistake, which is essentially the same idea. Great. I'm just going to give you one more minute and then we'll bring it back. If you're thinking of questions that you want to ask at the end of this presentation, now's the time to put them in the chat window or to get them ready so that sorry, I got distracted by a text message from Lorraine showing me what's happening in the room. It's fantastic. Okay, beautiful. Recognize every contribution. All right, so let me bring those slides back. I'm going to give you some really quick ones. Like I said, my workshop today and my workshop tomorrow really focus on congressive classrooms. Several times today, you've heard me use notice and wonder. They are my favorite two questions for the classroom because they have students connect their own thinking to the mathematics, to have their own ideas, to have their own questions for themselves. You can't criticize ideas people have, or at least you shouldn't, and that's the things they notice, so they're worth honoring as well. So that's the feeling safe. That should say no wrong answers, not no right answers, but maybe it's both. There's no one answer. I didn't use this, but I'm really liking slow reveal graphs. So where you strip off the information and progressively add it in to add more context, but have students notice and wonder for themselves at each stage. It really helps with comprehension of graphs. Multiple representations, and particularly graphically. I didn't see, at least to my knowledge, these kinds of things at school, and yet when I discovered them much later, actually beyond my university degree, I just would marvel of how beautiful and elegant some of these graphical representations are of mathematical concepts. Maths discussions and maths debates, which I'll talk about this afternoon. So here, for example, I might randomly group students into groups of 3. They need to work out who's A, B, and C, and then I'll show this slide. They need to defend this way of calculating 13 times 24, even if they don't believe it's the best way of doing it. So rich mathematical discussions. And non-permanent vertical surfaces where students are up doing the work for themselves. So a final book plug. I mention this one in almost every workshop I give because it is just astonishingly good at connecting primary classrooms in particular, but it's also useful for secondary and tertiary classrooms with the authentic mathematical practices of mathematicians. So look at this table of contents. Mathematicians make mistakes, they're precise, they ask questions, they connect ideas, they use their intuition, which is a really valuable part of mathematics. They prove and they work alone and together, and both of those things are important. So one final word. As you head out into the rest of today's conference, I'd encourage you to be on the lookout for ways to humanize your classroom, to make it more inclusive, and then share them during the day with each other, back in your schools, and with me on social media or on email or wherever you may find me. Because diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice, and it's our choice. Thank you very much. And so now I think something's going to happen.
Hi, Amie.
Hi.
It's Paula here I'm the Executive Officer of MOA, and I'm going to see if we've got any questions for Amie. I'm just going to give the audience here a bit of an idea. You're going to ask a question. I'm going to repeat it. The reason being, Amie's on a 10-second delay. So give her a chance to think, but we'll get the question again. Does anyone have any questions for Amie? Okay, Amie, I'm going over to Tyrrell.
Good morning, Amie, and sincerely thank you. I've just been talking here about the fact that mathematics I teach as a foreign language, and I have found that very useful for creating increased inclusivity so that students understand what we're talking about.
So is that something you've pulled from your training? Are you trained in teaching formal languages, or is that a mindset that you've got? Because it sounds fascinating.
It is a mindset, and one that I have used extensively, especially with gifted students who have a huge number of what-if questions.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing.
Anyone else? Don't be shy. We're in a very large room, Amie, so it takes me a while to get between people.
No worries, you can get your daily exercise, Paula.
Do you have the figures? You put the figures up university and all the way up to professors, but do you have the figures that would show us the patterns in maybe upper secondary school, year 11 and 12s?
Yes, so in the on the slide for the undergraduate one, I put a link to the discipline profile for the Australian Mathematical Sciences Institute, and that has all the school data, I think. So you can access that one from AMSI's website and download it. And that's a really good question, because it reminds me to point out that just after this session, you'll be able to get the slides from that tiny URL that's on the screen. So I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but you can access them in that PDF.
Any further questions, comments? Everyone's just taking photos of your slide, Amie. I'd like to let you know that, so I've been watching Amie prepare this presentation and stressing about it on her Twitter feed. And I think she finally put it together and felt comfortable with it yesterday. So what I'd like you to do is, I am devastated that Amie is not here in the room for you to meet this amazing young woman. She will drop anything and everything, as she proved to me a couple of years ago by coming to the Maths Empowering Girls Day to give a 10-minute speech at the end to inspire our Year 9 students. So I'm going to ask everyone here, we need to show Amie that we, unfortunately, you may support the Eagles or the Dockers. But could we have that kind of congratulations and round of applause for Amie? Thank you.
I'm sorry, guys. You sound like there's not enough of us in the room. We need more noise. Go for it. Thanks again, Amie, and I'm sure there are going to be people in this room who are going to look forward to your workshops today and tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you later. Thank you.
You too, folks. Thank you very much. Have a good day.